The morning in occupied France began not with birdsong, but with the whistle of a locomotive cutting through the mist. A freight train, loaded with fuel drums and crates of ammunition bound for the Atlantic coast, clattered along the steel tracks outside a rural station. The crew, weary from weeks of tension and long hours, leaned from the cab to survey the countryside. The war was everywhere. Requisitioned farms, camouflaged bridges, and nervous gendarmes patrolling the platforms. Yet for the men working the rails, survival meant focusing on their task, keeping the Reich's lifelines moving. That fragile sense of normalcy shattered in an instant. A new sound rose above the rumble of steel wheels, a deep, menacing roar that seemed to vibrate the earth itself. At first it was distant, like thunder rolling across the hills, but it grew sharper, angrier. The German engineer stiffened. His fireman looked up, eyes narrowing as silver specks streaked out of the clouds. The shriek of engines tore open the morning calm, and then the world erupted. From above, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts dived in formation, their massive radial engines snarling as they bore down on the target. 850 caliber machine guns per plane spat fire, tracers tearing into the locomotive. Sparks flashed along the rails as bullets chewed through steel, ripping into boilers and fuel tanks. An instant later, a shell exploded inside the train's cargo, sending a fountain of flame and shrapnel into the sky. The crew barely had time to leap from the cab before the engine burst apart, a geyser of steam and twisted iron. Freight cars jackknifed, flipping from the rails like toys. Smoke and steam mingled with the acrid stench of burning oil, cloaking the wreckage in a choking black veil. Civilians working near the station screamed and fled for ditches. Farmers abandoned their wagons and sprinted across fields as the planes swept lower, strafing anything that moved. German soldiers stationed nearby scrambled for their rifles, but their small arms fire was meaningless against the armored juggernauts. The ground quaked under the assault. For the Luftwaffe, this was not merely another attack. It was a revelation of vulnerability. The arteries of German logistics, thought to be resilient and hidden by camouflage, were suddenly laid bare. The pilots of the Thunderbolts, young Americans hardened by months of combat, felt the recoil of their guns hammering through their cockpits. They could smell cordite mixing with engine fumes, hear the metallic rattle as thousands of rounds discharged in seconds. Each pass brought new explosions, locomotives shattering, freight cars bursting, bridges collapsing into rivers. The rail system, Germany's crucial means of sustaining its armies across occupied Europe, was being shredded before their eyes. From the ground, the sight was apocalyptic. A train yard that had moments earlier hummed with activity now lay in ruins. The rails glowed red where fuel burned, twisted into grotesque shapes by the heat. Locomotives, once symbols of industrial might, were reduced to silent hulks bleeding steam into the morning sky. For the railway workers, terror was matched by disbelief. They had endured bombings of cities, artillery shells on front lines, but never this. Precision fighters ripping apart their world at such low altitude they could see the whites of the pilot's eyes. Survivors crawled through mud, ears ringing, choking on smoke, as they watched another wave of P-47's thunder past. The Luftwaffe pilots who would later hear of this raid struggled to grasp its magnitude. Dozens of locomotives destroyed in mere hours, a massacre of steel and fire that left rail networks crippled. This was not a random strike. It was the culmination of Allied planning, a deliberate shift from air combat to the systematic strangling of German logistics. The Jug, as the Thunderbolt was affectionately nicknamed by its pilots, had grown from a clumsy escort fighter into a ground attack titan. Its rugged design allowed it to dive into flak and return home riddled with holes, yet still flying. Its firepower made it a terror to anything that rolled on tracks or wheels. And on this day in France, it showed just how devastating that transformation had become. The scene left behind spoke volumes. Rails bent into molten curves, freight scattered in fields like spilled matchsticks, civilians weeping as their livelihoods went up in flames, soldiers stunned at their impotence. Overhead, the last of the P-47s disappeared into the horizon, their mission complete, their message unmistakable. The Reich's lifelines were no longer safe. For German command, the shock was profound. No longer could they assume their trains would arrive. No longer could they mask their movements with camouflage nets and night runs. The Thunderbolts had exposed a fatal weakness. As the smoke cleared, silence returned, broken only by the hiss of ruptured boilers and the crackle of fire consuming wood and coal. Survivors stumbled among the wreckage, taking in the scale of the devastation. In one day, the backbone of transport in this sector had been broken. This was not just the loss of machines. It was the unraveling of Germany's ability to fight a war on multiple fronts. The war in the air had reached the rails, and as German pilots would soon learn, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not only a formidable opponent in the sky, but also the executioner of their supply lines. The day of fire on the French rails was a grim prelude to the storm that was gathering, a storm that would engulf the Reich in destruction from above and hasten its collapse from within. The year was 1940, and the world was sliding deeper into chaos. In Europe, the Luftwaffe roared across the skies of France, while Britain braced under the weight of relentless bombing. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched uneasily, its industry still not fully mobilized for the storm that was surely coming. Inside the workshops of Republic Aviation on Long Island, the smell of oil and steel hung thick in the air as engineers bent over drafting tables late into the night. Blueprints sprawled like battle plans, calculations filled blackboards, and cigarette smoke curled above weary men in rolled-up sleeves. Their task was monumental: to create a fighter unlike any seen before, one that could meet the demands of a war not yet theirs, but looming on the horizon. It began not with elegance, but with brute necessity. Republic's lead designer, Alexander Kartveli, had watched European developments with concern. Germany's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Britain's Spitfires were sleek, nimble machines designed for speed and agility. Yet Kartveli envisioned something radically different. He proposed a fighter that would not win by grace in the sky, but by sheer power, ruggedness, and fire. The prototype on his drafting table was enormous, so large that skeptics scoffed it would never leave the runway. At nearly 10,000 pounds, it was heavier than many light bombers of the day. But at its heart would be an engine that changed everything: the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. The R2800 was a marvel of American engineering. An 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, it could produce more than 2,000 horsepower, power enough to hurl the massive aircraft into the air and push it past 400 miles per hour. To house such an engine required a fuselage of immense bulk, a cowling wide enough to give the plane a barrel-chested look. Its wings were thick, strong, and built to carry not just fuel, but also a deadly load of .850 caliber Browning machine guns, later supplemented with bombs and rockets. On paper, it looked ungainly, a brute compared to the graceful silhouettes of its European rivals. Critics dismissed it as too heavy, too clumsy, too slow. Yet Kartveli persisted. He knew that the future of air combat would not just be duels in the stratosphere, but also a grinding war of attrition, where durability and firepower mattered as much as speed. The first prototypes rolled out of the hangars in 1941, their aluminum skins gleaming in the sunlight. Mechanics worked tirelessly to prepare them for flight tests, adjusting controls, tightening bolts, and praying that the massive new fighter would live up to the promises inked on blueprints. Test pilots climbed into the cavernous cockpits, enclosed by a bubble canopy that offered unprecedented visibility. When the Double Wasp roared to life, the ground shook. The plane taxied awkwardly at first, its large size betraying its ungainliness. But then, with the throttle pushed forward, the Jug, as it would soon be nicknamed, thundered down the runway, lifting into the air with surprising grace. The doubters fell silent. As war drew nearer for America, the pressure to produce mounted. Republic Aviation expanded production with breathtaking speed. By 1942, assembly lines buzzed with activity, echoing with the clang of rivet guns and the hiss of welding torches. Factories in Farmingdale and Evansville turned out fuselages, wings, and engines at a pace never before seen. Women in kerchiefs and overalls worked alongside men, their hands blackened by grease, their shifts stretching long into the night. Each completed aircraft rolled off the line like another weapon forged in steel, destined for the skies over Europe. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts would be built, an industrial triumph that symbolized America's ability to outproduce and outlast its enemies. Yet the plane's debut was far from flawless. Early models, known as the P-47B, suffered teething problems. Engines overheated, controls stiffened at high speeds, and pilots struggled to adapt to the fighter's bulk. Some nicknamed it the Jug, not out of affection, but derision, likening it to a milk jug too large to maneuver in combat. But as with many revolutionary designs, time and refinement revealed its strengths. Engineers added better turbo superchargers, ensuring the aircraft could maintain power at high altitude. Armor plating was reinforced, allowing pilots to survive hits that would tear other fighters apart. Drop tanks extended its range, answering one of its greatest weaknesses. With each modification, the Jug grew deadlier. For the pilots who first climbed into its cockpit, the Thunderbolt was a revelation. The cockpit itself was spacious and heavily armored, a fortress in the sky. A pilot sat surrounded by thick glass and steel plates that could absorb punishment from flak and enemy fire. The instrument panel bristled with gauges and dials, overwhelming at first glance but reassuring once mastered. The canopy, with its nearly all-around visibility, gave flyers an edge in spotting enemies above and below. And when they pressed the trigger on the control stick, the plane came alive in a storm of firepower. 8 Browning M2 machine guns unleashing a torrent of bullets that could shred aircraft, trains, and tanks alike. Word of the P-47's durability spread quickly. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts returning to base riddled with bullet holes, engines coughing, landing gear barely functional, yet still intact. One famous account told of a P-47 limping back with part of its tail missing and oil streaming from the engine, but the pilot walked away unharmed. In another, a Thunderbolt survived a head-on collision with a German fighter, its massive frame absorbing the impact long enough to make it home. The aircraft's weight, once criticized, became its greatest strength. It was a tank with wings, and its pilots came to trust it with their lives. Behind the machine lay the vast machinery of American industry and logistics. Aluminum from Pittsburgh, engines from Connecticut, machine guns from Massachusetts, all flowed into Republic's factories with seamless precision. Railroads carried wings across states, trucks delivered engines to assembly plants, and thousands of workers labored in unison. The P-47 was not just a fighter. It was the embodiment of a nation's industrial might harnessed for total war. Every rivet driven, every panel polished, carried with it the determination of a workforce united by the belief that their labor could shape the outcome of battles an ocean away. By the time America fully entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the P-47 stood ready. Its massive silhouette contrasted with the more elegant lines of the Spitfire or the Bf-109, but its presence on the runway inspired confidence. Pilots learned to use its speed in dives, its resilience in combat, and its unmatched firepower to dominate the skies and the ground alike. Though initially tasked with escorting bombers deep into Germany, its limited range soon exposed its shortcomings in that role. Yet even as doubts resurfaced, the Jug was on the verge of revealing its true purpose, not only as a fighter of the skies, but as the scourge of German logistics. The birth of the Thunderbolt was more than an engineering feat. It was a story of vision against skepticism, of industry rising to the demands of global war, of men and women working tirelessly to forge a weapon that would prove decisive. What began as a machine too heavy to be believed became one of the most feared fighters of the conflict. Its journey from drawing board to battlefield reflected the very essence of America's wartime transformation, an industrial giant awakening, prepared to meet the storm head-on. The Jug was forged in steel, but it was tempered in the fires of necessity, and soon, as it thundered over the skies of Europe, it would show that brute strength, married to ingenuity and industrial might, could change the course of war. The sky over Germany in 1943 was a dangerous place for anyone wearing the roundel of the United States Army Air Forces. A squadron of B-17 flying fortresses droned steadily across hostile territory, their contrails stretching in white ribbons behind them. Below, the green fields of Europe hid flak batteries. Above, invisible eyes searched the heavens for bombers to strike. Inside one of the escorting P-47 Thunderbolts, a young American pilot adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon. His mission was simple: protect the bombers. But as the minutes dragged on, he knew a painful truth. When the fortresses reached the heart of Germany, his Thunderbolt would not have the fuel to stay with them. Soon, he would turn back, leaving the bombers naked against the fury of the Luftwaffe. This weakness became apparent within weeks of the Jug's combat debut. The P-47 could fight at high altitudes, dive faster than any German plane, and absorb punishment like a flying tank. But range was its Achilles heel. With drop tanks still experimental and long legs yet to be engineered into its design, the Thunderbolt could not escort bombers all the way to Berlin or deep into the Ruhr. Luftwaffe fighters waited until the American escorts turned back, then tore into the bomber streams with brutal efficiency. Fortresses limped home riddled with holes, sometimes missing entire engines, wings peppered with cannon fire. The loss rates were unsustainable. American tacticians and pilots faced a critical choice: accept the P-47 as a limited escort fighter, or find a new role for the heaviest single-engine fighter in the world. The answer emerged from necessity. Commanders realized that if the Jug could not fly all the way to Berlin, it could still dominate the skies over France, Belgium, and Western Germany. And there, it could do something even more destructive than dueling Messerschmitts. It could smash the arteries of German supply. Training shifted almost overnight. Pilots accustomed to high-altitude patrols began learning new techniques: how to dive-bomb bridges, how to strafe moving convoys, how to attack targets with rockets and bombs. They practiced screaming descents at 400 miles per hour, pulling up at the last second after releasing ordnance. The Jug's heavy frame, once mocked, now worked in their favor. It could carry a full ton of bombs, plus rockets slung beneath its wings, without losing stability. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a flying sledgehammer. The first missions were tentative, probing the effectiveness of this new doctrine. A squadron of Thunderbolts swept across northern France, searching for trains. When they found one, they dove in pairs, guns blazing. The results stunned even the pilots. Boilers exploded in clouds of steam, freight cars burst apart, ammunition detonated in chain reactions. German troops scattered helplessly, firing rifles into the sky as the Thunderbolts banked and returned for second runs. The Jug had found its element. Accounts from pilots paint vivid pictures of this transition. Cockpits filled with smoke as flak burst around them, black puffs peppering the air with shards of hot steel. Tracer rounds whipped past canopies in red and green arcs. One pilot described the moment he strafed a German truck convoy. "I pressed the trigger and felt the whole plane shake as 8 Brownings opened up. When the dust cleared, the road was littered with wreckage, engines burning, men scattering into the ditches. The Jug took hits, but she kept flying." Another recalled seeing a locomotive erupt beneath him, the fireball so large it singed the belly of his Thunderbolt. The Germans quickly recognized the danger. Flak batteries multiplied around bridges and rail yards, and camouflaged convoys crept along forested roads. Yet the sheer resilience of the Thunderbolt turned flak into a gamble. Many returned to base riddled with holes, missing panels, even with cylinders knocked out of their engines, yet still capable of landing. For the Luftwaffe, it was infuriating. To down a Jug required an extraordinary effort, while even one Thunderbolt could devastate a supply line. By mid-1943, the shift in doctrine was unmistakable. The P-47, once criticized as too short-ranged for escort work, was now spearheading a campaign of air interdiction. Bridges collapsed, rail lines lay in twisted heaps, and convoys burned by the dozen. German commanders complained that they could no longer move troops in daylight without risking annihilation. The Reich's logistics were bleeding under the relentless hammering of the Jug. The transformation of the P-47 from escort disappointment to ground attack beast revealed the flexibility of American air power. Where one mission failed, another rose. The Jug became the scourge of the German rear, a weapon not only of air superiority, but of systematic strangulation. And as the Allies prepared for the great invasion of Europe, the lessons learned in smoke-filled cockpits and over shattered rail yards would set the stage for an even greater onslaught. The P-47 had drawn blood, and soon it would draw far more. The morning of that day in 1944 began with the rhythmic pulse of iron wheels clattering along steel rails. German railway crews prepared convoys in occupied France, lining locomotives in rail yards heavy with fuel, munitions, and troops bound for the coastal defenses. Black coal smoke curled into the cool air, drifting above warehouses, signal towers, and lines of freight cars. It seemed at first like any other morning of the war, grim but routine, another day of moving the lifeblood of the Reich across a continent braced for invasion. Then came the distant hum, faint at first, like bees gathering in the horizon. Heads turned skyward. The sound grew louder, heavier, until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. In seconds, the routine was shattered. Out of the sun streaked silver shapes with wide, barrel-chested fuselages and wings thick enough to carry half a ton of ordnance apiece. They came in swarms, dozens of them, descending like avenging angels. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, their Pratt & Whitney engines bellowing, hurtled toward the rails in coordinated squadrons. The first tracers cut across the sky in red and white lines, sparking against steel. Locomotives, still warm with steam, erupted under the barrage. Boilers burst in clouds of white vapor. Freight cars tore open like tin, and entire yards vanished in walls of fire. German engineers scrambled from their engines. Soldiers dove for ditches. Civilians sprinted across fields, but the storm from above gave no reprieve. The operation had been planned with precision. Allied intelligence had identified the rail networks as the arteries feeding the German war machine in France. With the invasion of Normandy imminent, it was no longer enough to bomb cities or industrial plants. The enemy had to be starved of movement itself. Trains carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements had to be stopped before they could reach the beaches. That morning, groups of Thunderbolts swept across multiple sectors, diving in relentless waves. Pilots worked in pairs, one strafing the locomotive's boiler, the other targeting the freight behind it. The effect was catastrophic. Locomotives exploded like grenades, their massive iron shells ripped apart by machine gun fire and rockets. Freight cars carrying munitions detonated in chain reactions, tossing debris skyward in mushrooming plumes. First-hand accounts reveal the scale of devastation. Pilots described cockpits vibrating under the recoil of their guns, the acrid stench of cordite filling their nostrils as they unleashed torrents of fire. One recalled seeing a locomotive burst so violently that fragments struck his Thunderbolt, denting its armored underside. Another recounted the shock of pulling up from a strafing run to find his canopy streaked with soot and debris from an explosion below. On the ground, German survivors told of entire rail yards engulfed in black smoke, the roar of rupturing boilers mingling with the screams of wounded men. Eyewitnesses spoke of freight cars hurled off rails, landing in fields like children's toys scattered by a giant's hand. By the time the last wave of P-47s banked toward home, The tally was staggering. In a single coordinated assault, 80 locomotives lay destroyed, their hulks still smoldering hours later. Tracks were twisted beyond recognition, yards transformed into charred graveyards of steel. Columns of smoke rose for miles, visible to German patrols rushing to the scene, who found only wreckage and silence punctuated by the hiss of ruptured steam lines. The rail system, already strained, had been shattered in a matter of hours. For the Reich, it was a logistical catastrophe. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters to counter the assault, but they arrived too late. The Thunderbolts had struck low and fast, vanishing into the horizon before German pilots could intercept. Reports later described the disbelief among Luftwaffe officers. The Thunderbolt, once derided as too heavy, too clumsy, had become the scourge of their rear areas. Now, its brute strength, speed in a dive, and unmatched firepower were crippling the Reich's ability to move. German commanders faced an impossible dilemma. Without trains, armies at the front could not be supplied. Yet moving trains by night reduced capacity and risked still more disaster. Day by day, the rail lifelines of occupied France were being severed. The symbolism of the attack resonated far beyond the wreckage. For the Germans, it was proof that their industrial empire, once thought unbreakable, could be undone not just in battles, but in the simple act of starving movement itself. For the Allies, it was vindication of strategy. The destruction of 80 locomotives in one day was more than an isolated victory. It was a demonstration of how tactical innovation, industrial might, and the courage of pilots converged into overwhelming force. The photographs taken after the raid capture the moment's grim poetry. Locomotives blackened into skeletal husks, freight cars stacked in heaps, smoke columns stretching skyward like tombstones of steel. The landscapes of France, already scarred by war, were now littered with the carcasses of Germany's lifelines. Soldiers wandering through the aftermath spoke in hushed tones, shocked not only at the destruction, but at the speed with which it had been delivered. The Jug had not simply attacked, it had annihilated. And in the shadows of those smoldering rail yards lay a deeper message. The Reich's defenses against the coming invasion had been weakened. Without locomotives, divisions could not be reinforced. Without fuel trains, tanks would stall. Without ammunition convoys, guns would fall silent. The day the Thunderbolts brought rails under siege was the day the Germans learned that even before Allied soldiers set foot on French soil, the arteries of their defense had already been severed. The smoke of burning rail yards still clung to the skies of France when the order came through German airfields: scramble, intercept, strike back. Mechanics rushed across tarmacs, dragging ammunition belts toward the waiting Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. Engines coughed and roared as young pilots, many barely out of flight school, strapped themselves into cockpits that smelled of gasoline and leather. Their eyes betrayed a grim awareness. They were climbing into machines that consumed fuel Germany no longer had to spare, to fight enemies who seemed to materialize in endless numbers. As throttles pushed forward and wheels lifted from cracked runways, the Luftwaffe's last hope rose into the morning air, chasing contrails that led only to exhaustion and despair. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that had once terrorized Europe. In 1940, its aircraft had swept across the continent like a steel tide, but 4 years of attrition had drained its strength. The defense of the Reich now depended on aircraft that were still formidable in design, but increasingly flown by boys instead of veterans. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek and deadly, and the rugged Focke-Wulf 190 remained capable opponents. Yet the men behind the sticks lacked the training once taken for granted. Many had barely 50 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. They were asked to face American pilots hardened by years of missions and flying machines that could take punishment their lighter German fighters could not endure. Fuel was the Luftwaffe's bleeding wound. The Allies' strategic bombing campaign had torn into synthetic fuel plants, leaving reserves dwindling by the month. Training flights were curtailed. Pilots often went into combat, with only the barest practice in gunnery or formation flying. Veterans recalled the agony of watching inexperienced comrades peel away in confusion during dogfights or vanish in flames after a single burst of enemy fire. Each mission consumed irreplaceable fuel, each loss another nail in the coffin of a force that could no longer sustain itself. When the Thunderbolts began their systematic campaign against trains and supply lines, the Luftwaffe tried desperately to respond. Reports from German commanders speak of disbelief. Entire sections of the Reichsbahn, once the backbone of troop movements, were reduced to rusting carcasses of locomotives and smoldering freight cars. Officers pleaded for fighters to protect the railways, but they were stretched too thin, forced to defend cities from bomber streams, airfields from constant harassment, and supply lines crumbling under P-47 and P-51 strikes. Even when interceptors rose, they often found themselves too late. The Thunderbolts had already vanished, leaving only columns of smoke and shattered steel. For those who did engage, the battles were brutal. One German pilot recalled diving on a formation of Thunderbolts attacking a bridge near Rouen. He squeezed the trigger, his cannons spitting shells, only to watch the American planes absorb the hits and keep flying. Then the jug turned, its .850 caliber machine guns stitching the air with streams of fire. His wingman disappeared in a flash of flame, and he barely limped back to base with holes punched through his wings. The resilience of the Thunderbolt stunned the Luftwaffe. Planes that should have gone down kept coming back. Pilots who expected to cripple them found themselves outgunned and outlasted. Morale within German ranks crumbled. The Reichsbahn, once a symbol of industrial order, became a graveyard. Rail yards were littered with twisted boilers, tracks torn apart like ribbon, freight scattered across the countryside. Engineers wrote in diaries of the futility of repairing lines by night, only to see them destroyed again by day. Soldiers traveling to the front told of journeys interrupted by sudden dives of Thunderbolts, of comrades burned alive inside train cars, of equipment reduced to wreckage before it ever reached battlefields. The sense of inevitability grew. If the trains could not move, neither could the Reich's armies. Meanwhile, across Allied airfields in England, confidence surged. American pilots strapped into Thunderbolts that bristled with fresh ammunition and fuel tanks filled to the brim. They knew they could hit targets deep into enemy territory and return, even with their planes riddled with holes. The industrial machine of the United States churned out replacements for every loss, ensuring squadrons were never short of aircraft. Mechanics worked around the clock, swapping out engines and patching bullet holes with practiced efficiency. Where Germany struggled to keep planes aloft, America overwhelmed the skies with sheer depth of resources. The contrast could not have been sharper. German pilots faced dwindling odds, flying with nerves frayed and machines often starved of maintenance. American squadrons, backed by factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles, flew with the knowledge that behind them stood an arsenal without equal. Every destroyed locomotive, every burning convoy, was proof that the tide had turned irrevocably. Desperation drove the Luftwaffe to experiment with radical solutions. Jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 262 were rushed into production, promising speed unmatched by the Allies. Yet fuel shortages, mechanical unreliability, and the overwhelming presence of Allied fighters at every airfield crippled their effectiveness. Flak batteries were expanded, dotting the countryside with guns, but even as they claimed Allied planes, more arrived the next day. The juggernaut could not be stopped. For the men on the ground, the psychological toll was devastating. Where once the German eagle had soared, now it limped, battered and bleeding. Pilots spoke of the humiliation of seeing their homeland skies dominated by enemy planes, of returning to bases where fuel drums were empty and comrades absent. Letters home carried quiet despair, cloaked in the language of duty but marked by the knowledge that the Luftwaffe's collapse was only a matter of time. The war had begun with the Luftwaffe dictating terms from the skies. It was ending with their fighters scattered, their fuel gone, their pilots worn thin. And with every locomotive that burned, with every bridge that crumbled, the reality grew starker. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect the Reich. The Jug, once underestimated, had become not just a weapon of destruction, but a symbol of inevitability. The collapse of Germany's air arm did not come with a single battle, but with a slow, grinding suffocation. Each sortie drained more fuel. Each loss thinned the ranks further. Each raid by the Thunderbolts pulled another thread from the tapestry of resistance. And as the Reichsbahn smoldered in ruin, even the most loyal pilots could see the truth. Their struggle was no longer about victory, but about delaying defeat. The wreckage of locomotives still smoldered when Allied troops pushed inland from Normandy in the summer of 1944. In villages liberated by advancing columns, civilians pointed to twisted rail yards and blackened freight cars as proof that the German war machine had lost its heartbeat. Where once trains had carried fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements toward the front, now only silence lingered. Broken boilers hissed into the empty air, their steel frames buckled and torn, their wheels half buried in rubble. The destruction of Germany's rail lifelines was more than a tactical blow. It was a symbol of a crumbling empire, its once proud arteries of steel reduced to lifeless husks. For the men who flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, the campaign against locomotives and supply lines carried a deeper meaning. They had watched German convoys scatter in panic, had seen ammunition wagons explode into towering fireballs, had felt the shockwaves rock their cockpits as bridges collapsed beneath their bombs. Many returned from missions with holes punched through wings, canopies streaked with soot, and control cables frayed by shrapnel. Yet they returned, again and again, carrying out the relentless strategy of interdiction that starved the German front. Veterans later described the Jug not only as a weapon, but as a shield, one that gave ground troops breathing room and stripped the enemy of its mobility before battle had even begun. The impact of the Thunderbolts campaign became undeniable after D-Day. As Allied soldiers fought their way through the bocage of Normandy, they depended on air superiority to prevent German counterattacks. Every destroyed locomotive meant one fewer train delivering reinforcements to the beaches. Every obliterated bridge forced the enemy to take longer routes, slowing their response. The destruction of 80 locomotives in a single day echoed far beyond the rail yards. It translated into tanks arriving late to the front, artillery pieces stranded without ammunition, and divisions forced to fight with dwindling supplies. In a war where timing often meant survival, the Thunderbolts' role in choking the enemy's movement proved decisive. The lessons were clear to commanders on both sides. Air power had matured from a supporting role to a central pillar of modern warfare. No longer was it enough to destroy enemy fighters in the air. Victory required dismantling the enemy's capacity to fight at all. The campaign against railroads demonstrated the power of strategic interdiction, striking not just at armies, but at the veins that fed them. Germany's dependence on rail transport had once been a strength, a testament to its industrial precision. Under the assault of Thunderbolts, it became a fatal weakness. For Germany, the psychological toll was as heavy as the material loss. Diaries of soldiers and civilians spoke of despair as train stations were transformed into infernos. Letters from railway workers recounted the hopelessness of repairing lines under constant threat of destruction. German pilots, already exhausted by the imbalance of numbers, reported disbelief at the sight of rail networks they once relied upon reduced to graveyards of steel. The Reichsbahn, long considered the pride of German efficiency, was now a cemetery of locomotives, each burned-out engine a marker of decline. For the Americans, the campaign revealed the immense power of industrial depth. The Thunderbolt itself was a machine of contradictions, mocked for its weight, doubted for its ungainliness, yet ultimately revered for its ruggedness and firepower. Its very bulk allowed it to withstand hits that would have torn lighter aircraft apart. Its Pratt and Whitney engine carried it home on missions where others would have fallen. And behind every jug stood the vast machinery of American production. Factories in Farmingdale and Evansville, railroads and shipping routes, men and women working day and night to deliver planes faster than they could be lost. It was this industrial engine, as much as the double wasp under each cowling, that gave the jug its thunder. Pilots remembered the roar of that engine long after the war ended. For some, it was the sound of salvation, the deep growl that carried them through walls of flak and brought them home to English fields. For others, it was the sound of destruction, the thunder that preceded trains exploding, convoys scattering, bridges collapsing. They spoke of the jug with reverence and awe, calling it both a savior and a punisher. One veteran described it simply: "She was the toughest thing I ever flew. She took care of me when no one else could." The legacy of the Thunderbolt extended beyond Europe. It carried into the Pacific, where its ruggedness and firepower found new purpose against Japanese targets. It remained in service long after the war, adopted by air forces around the world. Yet its most enduring legacy lay in the lessons it carved into the doctrine of air power. The jug had proven that control of the skies was not enough. Destruction of supply was equally vital. Air power could do more than fight battles. It could paralyze an enemy before the battle began. The human cost of that lesson was immense. Thousands of railway workers, soldiers, and civilians perished in the infernos left by strafing runs and bomb blasts. Pilots faced the terror of flak and the agony of watching comrades vanish in smoke and fire. The jug's legacy is not only one of triumph, but of sacrifice, of men who risked their lives to dismantle an empire's lifelines, and of those on the ground who bore the brunt of its fury. War's brutality was written across the rail yards of France, where steel and flesh alike were consumed in the struggle to decide Europe's fate. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Thunderbolt's story remained etched into the ruins of the Reich. Rail yards lay abandoned, their twisted wreckage a reminder of the day Allied power came from above with irresistible force. Survivors walked through fields still littered with iron husks, knowing that the empire once fueled by those locomotives had crumbled. The jug had played its part in dismantling that empire, not with elegance, but with thunder, fire, and relentless weight. Today, restored Thunderbolts still fly at air shows, their radial engines echoing across the skies in a deep, resonant growl. Spectators watch in awe as the massive fighter banks and roars past, a relic of a time when the fate of nations turned on wings of steel. Veterans who hear that sound find themselves carried back to those days, days of smoke-filled cockpits, tracer fire streaking past, and locomotives erupting beneath their wings. For them, the jug is more than history. It is memory, as vivid as the day they flew it. The destruction of locomotives was not just about trains. It was about mobility, about breaking the very rhythm of an enemy's war machine. It proved that wars are not won solely in battles of men against men, but in the calculated destruction of the systems that sustain them. The P-47 Thunderbolt, forged in steel and tempered in fire, taught the world that lesson at a terrible cost. And in doing so, it left behind a legacy not only of power, but of inevitability, proof that when industrial might and tactical innovation meet on the battlefield, even the strongest empire can be brought to its knees.